After Sunday dinner, Dad called a family meeting, something that wasn't unusual for us. He always believed in transparency when it came to major decisions. However, this time felt different. Mom sat unusually quiet, her hands clasped tightly on the table, while Dad's expression was more serious than I'd ever seen. "Kids," he began, his voice steady but firm, "your mom and I have finalized our estate plan. We wanted to sit down and talk with you face to face, so there won't be any misunderstandings later." Avery, my older brother, leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. "This should be good," he muttered under his breath. Mom shot him a disapproving look, but he didn't flinch. Sophia, the youngest, sat to my left, nervously picking at her fingernails. Dad sighed, looking at each of us in turn. "Here's how it's going to work. Hunter, you'll inherit the majority of the family business. Avery, you'll receive the lake house and the rental properties. Sophia, the trust fund your mother and I set up will be yours." It took me a moment to process his words. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but this definitely wasn't it. "The business? Me?" I glanced at Avery and immediately regretted it. His face was stormy, his jaw clenched, and his eyes burning with anger. "The business?" Avery's voice was sharp. "Dad, I've been working in the company longer than Hunter. I was there when it was struggling to stay afloat." "I know that," Dad replied, his tone calm, yet firm, "and I appreciate everything you've done. But Hunter's the one who's turned it around these last few years. He's chosen leadership and dedication." "And I haven't?" Avery snapped. "Avery," Mom said softly, "this isn't about you. It's about what's best for the future." Avery let out a bitter laugh. "Right, of course, because Hunter's always been the golden boy, hasn't he?" "That's enough," Dad said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't up for debate. The decision is final." The tension in the room was unbearable. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the situation, but I was too stunned to speak. Avery abruptly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "Fine," he said coldly. "If that's how it's going to be, then fine." He stormed out, leaving the rest of us in awkward silence. Mom looked as though she was about to cry, while Sophia stared at her plate, her cheeks flushed. I didn't sleep much that night, replaying the scene in my mind. Avery's reaction wasn't surprising. He had always been competitive, always felt he had something to prove, but this time it felt different. There was a venom in his voice I hadn't heard before, a fury that sent chills down my spine. The first sign that something was wrong came a week later. I was at the office working on some quarterly reports when Sophia called me unexpectedly. "Hey," she said, her voice tense. "Are you home?" "No, I'm at work," I replied. "Why?" "It's Avery," she said. "He's been weird ever since the meeting. I overheard him talking to Mia last night. He kept mentioning something about a lawyer." "A lawyer?" My stomach dropped. "He's probably just venting. You know how he gets when he's upset." "No," she said firmly. "This wasn't venting. It sounded like he was planning something big." I sighed. "I'll talk to him, don't worry." But even as I said it, a knot of unease formed in my chest. Things got stranger at the family barbecue the following weekend. Avery was overly friendly, almost as if trying to make up for his outburst. "Hunter," he said, clapping me on the back as I helped Dad flip burgers, "how's the golden boy doing?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine. You?" "Oh, you know me," he replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Always busy, always planning." He turned his attention to the grill, but I noticed his jaw tighten when Dad asked me about a new project at the company. Later, I saw him and Mia whispering in a corner of the yard. They stopped talking as soon as I walked by, their expressions unreadable. The breaking point came a few days later when Avery invited me to lunch. He rarely asked to spend time with me one-on-one, so I was immediately suspicious. Still, I went, hoping to clear the air. I went out on a small cafe downtown, and Avery wasted no time getting to the point. "Look, Hunter," he said, leaning forward, "let's not beat around the bush. You don't actually want the business, do you?" I was caught off guard. "Of course I do. Why wouldn't I?" "Come on," he said, his tone sharp. "You're not passionate about it, not like I am. Dad gave it to you because you're his favorite, not because you earned it." The accusation hit me like a punch. I stared at him, stunned. "At Avery, that's not true. I've been working my ass off to keep the business afloat, and you know that." "Sure," he said with a bitter smile. "But you're not me. You don't deserve it." My fists clenched under the table, but I forced myself to stay calm. Dad made his decision. If you have a problem with it, take it up with him. "Oh, I plan to," he said with a smirk. "But don't say I didn't give you a chance to do the right thing first." That night I couldn't shake the conversation. Sophia's warning echoed in my mind, and I began noticing all the details I had missed. Avery's sudden friendliness, the whispered conversations, the lawyer comment. It was all adding up to something big, but I didn't know what. The final straw came when I received an email from Jackson, our family lawyer. It was vague, just a request to schedule a meeting about potential estate concerns, but it confirmed my suspicions. Avery wasn't just upset, he was plotting. If I wasn't careful, he was going to take everything. I stared at Jackson's email for a long time, reading the words over and over. Potential estate concerns felt like code for Avery stirring the pot. What worried me most was how quickly Jackson had gotten involved in whatever my brother was planning. I chose not to respond immediately and instead called Sophia. "Hey," I said when she picked up. "You were right. Avery's definitely up to something." There was a brief pause before she replied, her tone a mixture of concern and vindication. "What happened?" she asked. "Is Gotten Jackson involved?" I said. "I just received an email about some estate issue. Please speak as money, please speak as my career, my status, please speak as my name. Please speak as money." "Please speak as money," plead Sophia said, her voice sharpening. "What could he even dispute? Dad's decision is legally binding, isn't it?" "Maybe," I replied, "but knowing Avery, he's probably found some angle to exploit." Sophia let out a heavy sigh. "You need to talk to Dad. This is spiraling out of control." I knew she was right, but the idea of dragging Dad into this mess made me feel uneasy. He'd already done his part. If Avery couldn't accept it, that was his problem. But if he was trying to unravel the entire plan, I couldn't just sit back and allow it to happen. I didn't have to wait long to see what Avery's next move was. The very next day, I arrived at the office to find a courier waiting with a thick envelope. The return address was Jackson's law firm. Inside was a formal letter stating that Avery had filed a legal motion to challenge the validity of Dad's will. At the basis, alleged undue influence. The accusation was absurd. Undue influence by whom? Dad wasn't someone who could be pressured by anyone, least of all me. But Avery clearly thought he could manipulate the narrative to his advantage. Furious, I immediately called Jackson. "Hunter," he answered, his tone carefully neutral. "I was expecting your call." What is this about?" I demanded. "Avery's claiming Dad was influenced into giving me the business? That's ridiculous." "I understand your frustration," Jackson said calmly. "But Avery is within his legal rights to file a challenge. As the executor of your father's estate, I'm obligated to treat his claims seriously." "So what happens now?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "There will be an investigation," Jackson explained. "Interviews, document reviews, and possibly even a court hearing if Avery decides to push it that far." I hung up, my blood boiling. This wasn't just about the business anymore. Avery was attempting to destroy everything Dad had worked for, and by pulling the rest of us into his scheme, he was jeopardizing the family itself. That evening, I decided to confront Dad. On the way to my parents' house, I rehearsed what I'd say, but the moment I walked in, his expression told me He already knew. "Let me guess," he said, setting down his coffee cup. "Avery?" I nodded as I sank into the chair opposite him. "He's claiming you were influenced into giving me the business. He's filed a legal motion." Dad sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. I thought he might try something like this." "You knew?" I asked, startled. "Your brother's been bitter about my decision since the day I told him," Dad replied. "But I didn't think he'd go this far." "What do we do now?" I asked. "We don't do anything," Dad said firmly. "I made my decision, and I stand by it. If Avery wants to waste his time and money fighting it, that's his choice, but I won't be bullied into changing my mind." 2 weeks later, things escalated again. One evening, as I was working late, Sophia called. Her voice was panicked. "Hunter, you need to see this," she said. "See what?" I asked. "Check your email," she replied. "Avery sent something to all of us." I opened my inbox, and there it was, a lengthy, rambling email from Avery outlining his grievances with Dad's decision. But what shocked me most was the extent he was willing to go. He accused me of manipulating Dad, claiming I had used my position at the company to influence him into cutting Avery out. "This is insane," I said, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the email. "That's not even the worst part," Sophia said. "Did you see what he said about Mom?" I read further, my heart sinking. Avery had accused Mom of pressuring Dad to favor me because I was supposedly her favorite. It was a cruel, low blow, even for him. "What is he trying to do?" I asked, more to myself than to Sophia. "It's trying to turn everyone against you," she said, "against all of us. And it's working. Mia's already calling family members, spreading his version of the story." I muttered. Of course she was involved. Avery had always been headstrong, but Mia had a knack for fueling his worst impulses. I realized I couldn't sit back and wait for Avery's next move. If he wanted to play dirty, I wouldn't let him win. I began digging into his finances, hoping to find something that could give me leverage. What I uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. Avery had taken out several large loans over the past year, most of which were unpaid. A quick chat with a mutual acquaintance confirmed that he and Mia were drowning in debt. Suddenly, everything clicked. This wasn't just about the business. Avery needed money, and he was desperate enough to tear the family apart to get it. I called Sophia to tell her what I'd discovered. "I knew it," she said. "He's not just angry, Hunter, he's desperate." "Desperate enough to do anything," I said grimly. "Then you need to be careful," she warned. "If he's willing to go this far, who knows what he'll do next?" She was right. Avery wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, or until I stopped him. Discovering Avery's financial troubles changed everything. This wasn't just about Dad's decision anymore. For Avery and Mia, this was about survival. They weren't just angry or bitter, they were desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. I didn't have to wait long to see how far Avery was willing to go. Just days after uncovering his debts, I received a formal letter from his lawyer. Avery wasn't only challenging the will, he was accusing me of financial misconduct. Specifically, he claimed I had used company funds to sway Dad's decision. The accusation was absurd. I had always kept the company's finances clean, spotless even, but the mere allegation was enough to raise suspicion, and suspicion meant scrutiny. Avery wasn't just trying to win, he was attempting to destroy my reputation and make me seem unfit for the role Dad had entrusted to me. I called Sophia as soon as I read the letter. "Is accusing you of what?" she exclaimed, her voice rising with disbelief. "Misconduct," I replied bitterly. "Basically, he's trying to make me look corrupt." "That's ridiculous," she said. "Everyone knows you've been keeping the business afloat." "Would you risk everything for what, a bigger share?" Sophia asked. "It's not about reason," I replied. "It's about creating suspicion. If he can make me look bad enough, maybe he thinks a judge will side with him." "Have you told Dad?" she asked. "Not yet," I admitted. I don't want to involve him more than he already is. You might not have a choice, she said. This is spiraling out of control. That evening, I decided to dig into Mia's involvement. Something about her had always bothered me, and now I had a reason to look deeper. I reached out to Emma, a close college friend who worked as a private investigator. "Can you investigate someone for me?" I asked. "Who's the target?" she replied, intrigued. "Mia," I said, "Avery's girlfriend. I need to know what she's been doing, who she's connected with, and where her money's coming from. Everything." Emma didn't press for details. "Give me a couple of days," she said before hanging up. Meanwhile, Avery was busy rallying family members to his side. Over the next week, I began hearing whispers. Relatives who had always stayed neutral now questioned my integrity, and longtime family friends avoided eye contact when they saw me around town. One afternoon, Sophia called, her voice tight with frustration. "Aunt Karen just called me," she said. "She told me Avery's been telling people you manipulated Dad into cutting him out." "What?" I asked, stunned. "He's claiming you've been scheming for years, pretending to be the loyal son, making Dad think you're the only one who cares about the business." "That's ridiculous," I said, my chest tightening. "I know," Sophia replied. "But the way he's spinning it, it sounds believable. He even has Mia saying she overheard you and Dad discussing the will." The audacity of it all made my blood boil. Avery wasn't just twisting the truth, he was fabricating an entirely false narrative, and somehow people were buying into it. A few days later, Emma called back. "I found something," she said, her voice serious, "and you're not going to like it." "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. "Mia has a history," Emma said. "She's been involved in at least 2 previous inheritance disputes. Both times, she was the girlfriend of someone fighting for a larger share." "What?" I asked, stunned. "It gets worse," Emma continued. "In one of those cases, her boyfriend ended up bankrupt after losing. She stayed just long enough to collect a payout from the settlement before vanishing. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Mia wasn't just manipulative, she was a professional. And now she had Avery in her sights. "Does he know?" I asked. "Hard to say," Emma replied. "But if I had to guess, probably not. Guys like Avery rarely see what's right in front of them until it's too late." Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to confront Avery directly. I called him and insisted we talk. Surprisingly, he agreed, though his tone was full of suspicion. We met at a coffee shop downtown, a neutral location. The moment he sat down, I cut to the chase. "Avery, I know about Mia," I said. His face darkened. "What about her?" "She's done this before," I said. "Twice, actually. She gets involved with men in inheritance fights, stirs up trouble, and then leaves when things fall apart." "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I have proof," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "Take a look for yourself." He didn't touch it. Instead, he glared at me, his jaw clenched. "This is a new low, even for you," he said. "A low blow," I repeated, my voice rising. "You're the one trying to ruin my reputation and tear this family apart. For what? To pay off your debts?" His eyes widened slightly, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. "That's right," I said. "I know about the loans, Avery. I know how much you and Mia owe. This isn't about Dad's decision. It's about money. You're desperate enough to destroy everything to get it." "You don't know anything," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "I know enough," I replied, "and if you keep pushing, I'll make sure everyone else knows too." For a moment, I thought he might back down, but the fire in his eyes told me otherwise. Avery wasn't giving up. If anything, my confrontation had made him even more determined. The next day, Jackson called me. "We've got a problem," he said. "What now?" I asked. "Avery filed a formal request for an injunction," Jackson explained. "He's trying to freeze the estate until the legal dispute is resolved." What does that mean? I asked, though I already knew. It means you won't have access to the business until the court makes a decision, Jackson said. If the injunction is approved, it could take months, maybe even years to sort out. I hung up, my heart pounding. Avery wasn't just trying to win the case. He was trying to drain me, to make it impossible for me to keep fighting. The tipping point came during a family dinner Mom insisted on hosting to clear the air, she'd said. But the moment we all sat down, it was clear that wasn't going to happen. You've gone too far, Avery, Dad said, his tone icy. This isn't about fairness anymore. It's about your selfishness. Selfish? Avery shot back. I'm selfish for wanting what's rightfully mine. It's not yours, Dad said firmly. It never was. The argument quickly escalated, voices rising as accusations flew across the table. Mom tried to calm everyone, but her attempts were drowned out by the shouting. The final blow came when Avery turned to me, his face contorted with anger. You've always been the favorite, he spat. You've always had everything handed to you, but not this time. I'll fight you every step of the way, and I'll win. I stood, my hands shaking. If you want to fight, Avery, you've got one. But don't think for a second you'll come out of this unscathed. As I left the house that night, I knew the battle lines had been drawn. There was no going back now. The stakes had never been higher. The fallout from that dinner was immediate. Mom called me the next morning, her voice trembling. Hunter, she said, I can't take this anymore. The fighting, the accusations, it's tearing us apart. I know, Mom, I said, trying to sound reassuring, though I wasn't sure how much reassurance I could offer. But Avery's the one doing this. He won't let it go. There has to be a way to fix this, she said, her voice breaking. You're brothers. You're supposed to protect each other, not destroy each other. Her words hit harder than I expected, but the anger I felt toward Avery burned brighter than my guilt. I've tried reasoning with him, I said, but he's made his choice. Now I have to protect what Dad built, and myself. Mom was silent for a moment before whispering, I'm scared of what this will do to our family. I didn't know how to respond. Deep down, I was scared too. The legal battle escalated faster than I could have imagined. Avery's injunction request was approved, freezing the estate and cutting me off from the business until the court made a decision. Worse, he used the court's ruling to bolster his claims. Family members who had been on the fence started siding with him, convinced he wouldn't have gotten this far without evidence. Sophia, thankfully, remained firmly in my corner. One evening, she arrived with a bottle of wine and a folder packed with research she had been compiling on Avery's and Mia's recent actions. You'll need this, she said, setting the folder down on the kitchen counter. Avery's not playing fair, so neither should you. I opened the folder and was immediately stunned by the contents. There were phone records, bank transactions, and even social media posts that painted a troubling picture of Mia's involvement. Cryptic messages between Mia and an unidentified third party mentioned contingency plans and payments. Even more alarming were substantial cash withdrawals from Avery's bank account, amounts he clearly couldn't afford given his financial situation. This is incredible, Sophia, I said, flipping through the documents. How did you get all of this? She smirked. Let's just say I have friends who don't mind bending the rules when it's for the right reasons. Her persistence gave me a much-needed boost, but it also highlighted just how far this conflict had escalated. This wasn't just about money or the business anymore, it was about survival. The next major confrontation came during a scheduled deposition. Both Avery and I, along with our legal teams, were required to attend. It was the first time we had been in the same room since the disastrous family dinner, and the tension was almost unbearable. Avery's lawyer wasted no time presenting their case. He painted me as a cunning opportunist who had exploited Dad's declining health to claim the bulk of the inheritance. He even referenced old emails between Dad and me, twisting harmless business discussions into something sinister. When it was my turn, my attorney, Jackson, methodically dismantled their arguments. He provided evidence of my contributions to the company and emphasized Dad's clear, intentional reasoning behind his decision. The most devastating moment, however, came when Jackson introduced the materials Sophia had gathered. "These financial records," Jackson said, holding up copies of Mia's bank statements, "suggest a coordinated effort to siphon funds from Mr. Avery's account. Furthermore, the communications between Mia and an unknown third party raise significant concerns about her intentions." Avery's face flushed red as Jackson laid out the details. For the first time, I saw a hint of doubt in his expression. Mia, seated next to him, seemed unfazed. She leaned over to whisper something to Avery, and whatever she said seemed to revive his resolve. By the end of the deposition, it was clear that neither side was ready to concede. The family felt the strain even more as the case dragged on. While Dad tried to remain neutral, his frustration with Avery became increasingly evident. Mom, on the other hand, grew more desperate to broker peace. One evening she called a family meeting at their house, insisting we all attend. When I arrived, Avery and Mia were already there, sitting together on one side of the living room. Sophia sat on the opposite side, the physical divide mirroring the emotional one. "Thank you all for coming," Mom said, her voice trembling. "We need to end this before it tears us apart." "There's nothing to end," Avery replied coolly. "I'm fighting for what's mine. If Hunter doesn't want this mess, he can step aside." "I'm not stepping aside," I said firmly. "You're the one dragging this out, Avery, just because you can't handle that Dad made his choice." "You mean your choice?" Avery shot back. "Don't pretend you didn't pressure him into giving you the business." "Enough," Dad's voice thundered, silencing the room. "I've had it with this nonsense. Hunter didn't manipulate me. I gave him the business because he earned it. If you can't accept that, Avery, that's on you, but don't you dare accuse your brother of something he didn't do." Avery looked momentarily stunned, but quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "You're as blind as he is," he said bitterly. "You always have been." Mia placed a hand on his arm and whispered something, but this time instead of calming him, it seemed to anger him further. He shrugged her off, his face a mask of rage. "Maybe you should stay out of this," he snapped at her. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Mia's eyes flashed with anger, but for once she said nothing. It was the first time I wondered if the cracks in their alliance were starting to show. A few days later, Emma called me. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Mia's been contacting lawyers, divorce lawyers." "Divorce?" I asked, confused. "She and Avery aren't even married." "Not legally," Emma replied. But she's claiming they have a common law marriage, and she's preparing to file for half of what he owns." Her jaw dropped. "Are you serious?" "As serious as it gets," Emma said. "Looks like she's trying to cut her losses before this all blows up in her face." The irony was almost too much to process. Mia, Avery's strongest ally in this fight, was now planning to betray him. If she succeeded, Avery could lose everything. The final blow came during a court hearing the following week. Mia's betrayal had rattled Avery, and it showed. He no longer carried himself with the confidence of someone determined to win. Instead, he looked like a man who realized too late that he had been fighting a losing battle all along. During the hearing, Jackson presented fresh evidence linking Mia to fraudulent activities in her past relationships. The revelations were damaging enough to make the judge question Avery's entire case. By the end of the day, the outcome was clear. As we left the courtroom, Avery avoided my gaze, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For a moment I felt the flicker of pity for him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the relief of knowing this nightmare was finally over. The fallout from the ruling was swift and harsh. The court dismissed Avery's case, upholding Dad's estate plan. The business was officially mine, just as Dad had intended, but the victory felt hollow. Avery didn't even attend the final hearing. According to Sophia, he had been keeping a low profile since Mia's betrayal became public knowledge. The family seemed to know the broad strokes of what had happened. Avery had trusted the wrong person, and it had cost him everything. For weeks, Avery ignored my calls and texts. Despite everything, I wanted to reach out to see if there was any way to mend what had been broken between us, but he wasn't interested. Eventually, Sophia filled me in on what had become of him. She visited him a few days after the court ruling and found him in a small, shabby apartment, having moved out after Mia left. "He's a wreck, Hunter," she said when she called me afterward. "Mia drained what little money he had left and disappeared. He's drowning in debt, but he's too proud to ask for help." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Do you think he'd even listen if I reached out?" I'm not sure," Sophia said. "He's angry, but I think it's more at himself than at you." I wanted to believe that, but the bitterness Avery had shown throughout this ordeal made it hard to hope. Meanwhile, the family was in shambles. Mom had fallen into a deep depression, blaming herself for not stopping the feud before it spiraled. Dad was doing his best to hold things together, but the stress was wearing him down. "It feels like I've lost both of my sons," he said one evening when I stopped by to check on him. "You haven't lost me, Dad," I said. "And you haven't lost Avery either. He just needs time." "I hope you're right," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. A month later, there was an unexpected knock at my door. When I opened it, Avery stood there, a shadow of the man he used to be. He had lost weight, and the confident air he once carried was replaced by a quiet, weary demeanor. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. I sat down at the kitchen table, the silence between us heavy and awkward. Finally, he spoke. "I messed up," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I let my pride, my anger, everything get in the way, and now I've got nothing to show for it." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to unleash all the frustration I had bottled up, to list every way he had hurt me and the family. But as I looked at him, I realized he didn't need me to. He already knew. "I don't know if I can fix this," he continued, his gaze fixed on the table, "but I had to come here. I had to tell you, I'm sorry." Hearing those words felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. For so long I had carried my anger and feelings of betrayal like armor, but in that moment I realized how much I wanted to let it go. "I'm sorry, too," I said at last, "for not realizing how much you were struggling, for not being the brother you needed." Avery looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You didn't do anything wrong, Hunter," he said. "This was all on me. It wasn't a perfect resolution. The scars from our feud would take time to heal, and some might never fully fade. But that conversation was a beginning, a chance to start rebuilding what we had nearly destroyed." Over the following months, life began to stabilize. Avery found a job in a nearby city as a property manager for a small real estate company. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it was steady and gave him an opportunity to rebuild his life. Mia, on the other hand, vanished completely. The last I heard, she was entangled in another legal battle with a different family. A part of me felt pity for her, but mostly I was relieved that she was no longer a part of our lives. The business continued to grow, though operating it without the shadow of the legal battle felt oddly surreal. For so long I had been consumed with defending my right to the company that I hadn't truly thought about what it meant to simply run it. Sophia, as always, remained my anchor. She stayed close, helping to mend the fractures within the family. Dad gradually began to forgive Avery, though it took him longer to forgive himself for the part he believed he had played in the conflict. Mom, however, remained distant. The strain of the fight had taken a toll on her, and though she never said it outright, I could sense she blamed herself for failing to keep the peace. Reflecting on everything, I'm not sure if there is a clear lesson to be learned. Family is complicated, messy, and sometimes painful. We hurt the people we love, often unintentionally, or maybe especially when it's unintentional. But if there's one thing I've come to understand, it's that family isn't defined by blood alone. It's about the choices we make every day, the choice to fight for one another, to forgive, to keep showing up even when it feels impossible. Avery and I are not the same as we were before all of this. Maybe we never will be, but we're trying, and for now, that's enough.